Pay close attention to this video. You are about to see something that has never happened in 1,000 years of military history. What you just saw there are Russian soldiers surrendering, but here's what many people don't realize. They are not surrendering to other soldiers. There are no Ukrainians in sight, no tanks, no infantry. These men just did something unprecedented. They surrendered to a machine in 15 minutes. Yes, just 15 minutes. This operation achieved what several attempts by Ukrainian infantry had failed to do. And this has a huge impact for Ukraine, because what you just saw wasn't just a battle. It's the solution to the biggest problem Ukraine is facing on the battlefield. To better understand, let me show you what this problem is. Look, Ukraine is literally in a race against time. That's because, while you're watching this video, Ukraine's population has already dropped from 52.5 million people to just 37,900,000. That's a drop of almost 15 million people in just over 3 decades. And Putin knows that. That's why Russia has been adopting a strategy that is simple but brutal. This strategy can be summed up in 2 words: pure attrition. In other words, he keeps sending Russian soldiers to die until there are no Ukrainians left to fight. It's a grim gamble that has already pushed Russia itself past the mark of 1 million casualties. There are reports that the Russians are losing about 1,000 soldiers a day. And of course, despite having lost fewer soldiers, estimates point to 400,000 Ukrainian casualties since the beginning of the invasion. So even paying a high price, Putin's strategy was working, at least until now. But now, something is happening that changes everything. Ukraine is managing to capture enemies without putting a single one of its soldiers at risk. And this completely breaks that logic of attrition. And you know what? That's exactly what's happening in the city of Kharkiv, in Ukraine. Now, before I explain how this was possible, I need to show you who's behind this historic operation. Because everything that's happening is not by chance. It was the result of one of the most lethal and innovative units that Ukraine has. I'm talking about Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade. This unit has an impressive track record. They were involved in the defense of Kyiv when the Russians nearly took the capital. They took part in the liberation of Kherson. They also fought in Bakhmut, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. In Avdiivka, they claimed to have killed 1,500 Russian soldiers and wounded another 3,500. And here's an interesting detail about them. Within this brigade, there is a subunit with a name that is no coincidence. A platoon in this company is called Deus Ex Machina. This name literally means God coming from the machine. It was exactly this unit that carried out the Kharkiv operation. And do you want to know how they did it? After all, how do you force veteran Russian soldiers entrenched in a fortified position to surrender to robots? The answer lies in what happened during those crucial 15 minutes. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because what broke those Russian soldiers wasn't exactly what you might be thinking. See, first came the first-person view drones. These are the kamikaze drones you've already seen in other videos from the war in Ukraine. They bombarded the Russian position, causing damage and creating the initial chaos. Up to this point, nothing too revolutionary. Then came the protagonist of this story, a Ukrainian ground robot called Targan-K. Some sources initially said it was a troika, but that information was denied. It was a robot entirely made in Ukraine, loaded with 22.5 kilograms of trinitrotoluene. That's equal to 3 anti-tank mines. A released video shows this robot advancing along a dirt path toward the Russian trench. As you can see, it has big, thick tires. And on its central platform is the explosive charge protected by a metal cage. When it explodes, it creates a massive fireball that completely engulfs the Russian position. Now stop to notice something. The first explosion didn't completely destroy the shelter. The Russian soldiers survived. And it was at that moment that the psychology of robotic warfare showed its devastating power. Because the Ukrainian operators did something that broke the minds of those soldiers. They sent a second robot. And then, something surprising happened. One of the drone operators involved in the mission said they, the Russians, realized we were going to blow it up again and very quickly showed the sign. Think about that for a moment. Those Russian soldiers were not facing a human enemy they could try to stop, deceive, or counterattack. They were facing a mechanical process of elimination, a relentless machine that would keep coming one after another until it destroyed them completely. They knew there was no escape. There was no possible negotiation with that robot. There was no mercy. There was no way to convince or distract it. It was just a matter of time until the next explosion. And it was in that moment of pure terror that 2 Russian soldiers emerged from the underground shelter, holding a hastily written cardboard sign. On the sign, we can see the words, "We want to surrender." And this event revealed something even more curious. Do you notice who the soldiers surrendered to? To the lens of a drone hovering above them. Stop and think. A machine was literally taking prisoners of war. And that had never happened before in history. Well, almost never, because there is a historical precedent that makes this comparison even more fascinating. In 1991, during the Gulf War, Iraqi soldiers surrendered to an American Pioneer drone on Failaka Island. But there's an important difference between the two events. In this case, they were surrendering to the drone that served as a pair of eyes for the human gunners on the battleship United States ship Missouri. The drone served as a communication tool. In Kharkiv, the Russian soldiers surrendered to the drone. The machine was no longer a tool, it was the very agent of war. It was the enemy itself. This marks a fundamental transformation in the nature of combat. In 33 years, we went from drones as extensions of soldiers to drones as substitutes for soldiers. And most impressively, after the surrender, a small commercial Mavic drone was used to guide the Russian soldiers. The Ukrainian operators gave remote instructions, and the soldiers followed the Mavic precisely and lay down in the dolphin position on the ground. Only after that did the Ukrainian infantry move forward to occupy the position. The end result was a complete tactical victory, with 0 Ukrainian casualties, 0 Ukrainian soldiers at risk, and 0 lives lost on the defending side. Now, I know many of you might be wondering how Ukraine managed to develop this technology. And here's where another fascinating part of this story comes in. Targan is produced by a Ukrainian company called Targun. This robot can carry up to 200 kilograms of cargo, has a control range of up to 2 kilometers, and can remain on standby for up to 48 hours. Soldiers on the battlefield often praise this drone for its cockroach-like resilience and simple, adaptable design. But the most impressive thing is how this robot was created. Remember when I mentioned the unit that carried out this historic operation? The company Platoon, Deus Ex Machina. Well, the commander of that same unit, known by the code name Makar, is the one behind the development of the Targon. Normally, when an army wants new equipment, it takes years. It has to go through approvals, tests, bureaucracy. The process is slow and complex. Ukraine did it differently. Makar and his team work side by side with the company that manufactures the Targon. When they test the robot on the battlefield and realize that something can be improved, they call the factory directly. In a matter of weeks, not years, the robot comes back modified and ready to be used. This speed of adaptation gives Ukraine a huge advantage because they can evolve their equipment at the speed of war, not at the speed of bureaucracy. Now, compare that with the way traditional armies operate. Normally, there are years of development, testing, and bureaucratic approvals. Ukraine, on the other hand, created something different, a culture of innovation without permission. While other armies wait for orders and equipment from above, the 3rd Assault Brigade created its own school for ground robot operators. They are not waiting for doctrine to be written or for equipment to be provided by a central command. They are writing the doctrine and developing the equipment while fighting. And this is part of a larger national strategy. Drone production in Ukraine has practically exploded. They went from 20,000 first-person view drones per month in 2024 to 200,000 per month in 2025. The goal is to produce between 4 and 5 million drones of all types by the end of this year. This represents a completely new form of military industrialization. Production is now based on agile and distributed manufacturing instead of large, centralized factories. The Ukrainians describe their unmanned systems as Lego sets. That's because the attack in Kharkiv itself combined different pieces. They used a first-person view drone, a kamikaze ground robot, and a reconnaissance drone. As you can see, this philosophy prioritizes adaptability, speed, and cost-effectiveness over the traditional pursuit of a single perfect and expensive platform. Meanwhile, on the other side, Russia faces the opposite. Before the war, they invested heavily in large, complex, and expensive robots like the Uran 9, which performed terribly in Syria. These robots, which look very impressive in parades, prove to be inadequate for real combat and are practically absent on the Ukrainian battlefield. Now, Russia is trying to copy the Ukrainian model with smaller and cheaper robots, but they arrived too late in this race. And that brings us to the most important question of this video. What do these robots represent for the future of war? First, this completely changes the calculus of war for Ukraine. If they can scale up this capability, they will force Russia to fight on Ukrainian terms. A war of technological attrition, not human attrition. This completely destroys Putin's plan to win this war. Second, this solves Ukraine's biggest strategic problem today. They needed to make up for the demographic disadvantage. Now, with machines replacing soldiers in the most dangerous missions, Ukraine's military strength is being significantly multiplied. Third, this represents a fundamental change in the psychology of war. In other words, the psychological barrier has been broken. Soldiers surrendering to robots is no longer science fiction, it's reality on the battlefield. And finally, everything indicates that this is just the beginning. That's because Ukraine plans to build and deploy up to 15,000 ground robots in 2025 alone. Now just stop and imagine that multiplied by tens of thousands. As you can see, the Kharkiv event was more than just a tactical victory. It demonstrated that the future of warfare is already here, and it's being written on the battlefields of Ukraine. Because when you can win battles without infantry and without losses, you're not just changing tactics. You're redefining what it means to wage war. And you, what do you think? Do you believe this technology can really change the course of the war in Ukraine? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this video brought you valuable information, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next analyses about the conflicts that are shaping our world. And share it with anyone you think needs to understand what's really happening on modern battlefields. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.